let's go over the salmon notes. And let's see here. There we go. Salmon. Okay, so basic salmon facts and terms. Salmon are anadromous, meaning that they are hatched and reared in fresh water, but spend part of life in sea before returning to fresh water to spawn. All native Pacific salmon die after spawning. Some North Atlantic salmon do not. So the North Atlantic salmon is a different genus, by the way, but it's its own creature. It's not speciated, whereas Pacific salmon, there are 5 species. So the genetics of both trout and salmon can be traced to a time when they shared a common gene pool. Pacific trout and salmon are genetically distinct from Atlantic salmon. And the mountains of salmon reading you have in there tells us how that happened. It's really a fantastic reading. While some lake trout can live up to be 60 years old or even more, the life cycle of salmon rarely extends more than 6 years. Spawning behavior, rainbow and cutthroat trout generally spawn earlier in the milder climates of more southerly or coastal areas. And the timing of Pacific salmon spawning varies greatly. How is that for useful? Talk about a bad generalization. It is so complex. I originally thought when I started studying this decades ago that I would make a nice, tidy generalization here, but really it's highly variable in space and time. So why do salmon and anadromous trout like sea-run cutthroat trout, or steelhead is another one. By the way, they can return to the sea, unlike salmon here on the Pacific side. So why do they do this? The benefits outweigh the costs. They take advantage of the abundant food of the ocean. Because of this, they return larger than most of the local competition. This allows them to dominate the best spawning locations and lay many large eggs with yolk that sustains their young for weeks. We do have a documentary that's about 53 minutes long that shows that, and it's just amazing. And yeah, stronger get better places to lay their eggs, spawn, and they're more likely to reproduce. So bigger, stronger is better in most habitats. Now, the speciation of salmon, though, does flow along to some degree the kind of habitat they like. That's another question. That's another thing that comes up in Montgomery's reading on mountains of salmon. I think you'll like that. Spawning behavior. Homing instinct aided by celestial navigation and detection of Earth's magnetic fields. Once in the home river, the olfactory sense is used, in other words, the sense of smell. So most salmon will return exactly to the same stream that they came from. A few will stray, and the strays give the salmon the possibility of colonizing other habitats, which it can do very rapidly if there's not much fishing or hunting predatory pressure on the population. Maybe up to 4 to 6 salmon return for every pair that mates in a home stream in that idealized setting. So, but that olfactory sense helps them get there. It's kind of an amazing thing. Still a bit of a mystery. So the growth is determined by interactions between hereditary and physical environment constraints. And so that has to do with where there's food and competition, predation, the right temperatures in the water to minimize stresses, and so on. Salmon and trout can grow throughout their lifetime. They're cold-blooded, and rates of growth and longevity are greatly influenced by water temperature. The metabolic rate increases with higher water temperature, so more food must be consumed. So salmon are really a kind of end of ice age kind of species nowadays, as we might think of them. Most of their recent genetic history has been in colder waters, and the waters where they find themselves now, most of them are warming notably in the world. And so that creates more stress. Warmer water means more food needs to be found. So for a given population size, they need to get more food. So that provides some constraints there. Oxygen levels, salinity, competition, and food availability also impact growth. Okay, so one of the things that happens out in the North Pacific is that herring is a big source of food for the salmon, and there seems to be some declines in herring populations in some regions. It's a cause for concern. What they eat. They're generalists and opportunists, meaning they'll eat pretty much anything that they can get. And that may explain why they're found in so many places. They have a great range. The Pacific salmon range all the way from northern Japan up around the Bering Strait, Alaska, all the way down to Central California. And if you talk to salmonids, the Oncorhynchus genus, you can find trout all the way in to, amazingly, some of the rivers of the state of Sinaloa and Sonora in Mexico, northwest Mexico. Yeah. In fact, my late father-in-law told me of trout that they would find in some of those rivers when he was a young boy, and maybe that was almost a century ago now. There may very well have had a better range, a larger range then than they do now. There's a great book by Behnke, Robert Behnke, on trout and salmon, collectors, Benkhe, an absolutely fantastic book that talks about that. So in freshwater, most rely heavily on aquatic insects, but feeding patterns can vary greatly by season. Crustaceans such as shrimp and crayfish can be significant. The life cycle, nice little diagram here, just kind of gives you a sense of how it all works. But basically, you can maybe start where you have spawning, somewhere like right about here, whether that's through hatchery propagation or through natural propagation. And the eggs in the stream and young fish live there until they're ready to migrate. And in that return, or that trip out to the ocean as smolts, when they get large enough, they go out as smolts. They'll have to pass the dams, which can be a real problem because there's a lot of slack water. And so there's amazingly barges carry some of them now, and then you'll see that in our documentary on the Columbia River salmon. So it's quite a complex life cycle, whether it's the hatchery route or the natural route. They enter the ocean. They stay there from 1 to 5 years. The Chinook staying there the longest. And then they have their own timing coming back. Could be any time of year, depending on where you are. So there's plenty of variables that keep their populations modest, especially the wild ones. We'll get to that question a little later. Okay. But one of the big things in our environment of dams in the Pacific Northwest is that they have to go, either they can't get through them, and so about 40% of the original Columbia River area, they literally can't go back to where their home streams were at all. So they are locally extinct in those areas because they simply aren't there anymore. But where they have ladders, that is a way to get back, and so some of them amazingly make some really, really, really long trips. And you'll see that in the one about the Snake River salmon, the sockeye. And that kind of characteristic color change, and you'll see that in the documentary as well. So I hope you enjoy that documentary. It's really a nice piece, and it does connect a lot of this life cycle and a lot of the things that happen. So they reproduce in cold flowing water by creating excavation in gravel called redds. As we said, big eggs. They leave birth, go downriver, eventually from the birth stream. And then some of them will stay a while in coastal estuaries, for example, in the Columbia or the Fraser, weeks sometimes before seaward migration. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting is when they return home, they do so without feeding, which makes them a bit more of a challenge to catch them. And so if they don't eat, then how do they return home? So they have a huge amount of energy stored from their stay out at sea as they've grown much larger in size. And so they bring back with them that fat, and that fat is their energy source. And they bring back also an enormous amount of nitrogen from the seas. Basically, that's what's formed in amino acids and proteins, and that greatly enriches as well the environments where they spawn. And we're going to see more about that on that documentary too. Okay. Now I want to look a little bit at wild salmon extinction. No, salmon aren't extinct per se overall, but there's been some big things that have happened, and I need to talk with you a little bit about that, to just tell you a little bit about the story. And these are little old numbers now. I haven't seen them sorted quite this way. It hasn't improved. This has all gotten worse since these numbers came out, so I'm not exaggerating here. But there's basically a mix between wild salmon and hatchery salmon, and the hatchery salmon have kept overall populations up, but salmon are now extinct in 40% of the rivers in which they historically spawn in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and California, with 106 major stocks extinct. The salmon populations in 44% of the remaining streams are at risk. And again, a lot of that was due to dam building. But even long since then, the numbers have been dwindling in the places where they can still spawn in, that they can return back to their home streams. So this is a little bit of a complex table. The concept here, I want you to understand this really, really important concept, and that is this. If you look at these three regions, the Alaska streams is one, the British Columbia streams as another here on the left, and the Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and California streams as the third. Historically, if you just take the Alaska ones, they were between 56 and 65% of all of the returning salmon in these three regions together, okay? So if you just take the returning salmon into the Western North American region, okay, 56 to 65 of those returnees historically were in Alaska streams. Now they are 81 to 90% of all the returning ones across this whole area over here, okay, including British Columbia and then down here in the United States. So it's not that their numbers have grown in the Alaska streams, but it's something else. What is it? Well, let's first look at the British Columbia streams. Their historic returns there were 19 to 26% of all of the salmon returning to all of these streams collectively. They were 19 to 26%. Now into the British Columbia streams, they're returning at 8 to 17%. And that number is actually down. There's been some real disasters here since the 90s, and this number is actually smaller than that. So there are a lower percentage of all the returning salmon into this whole region here now. And if you thought that was bad, look at this one. Historically, about 15 to 16% of all the returning salmon on the Western North America salmon coast was from these areas, U.S., 15 to 16%, now 1% roughly of all the returning salmon in this entire region of Alaska, BC, and the Western United States. Only 1% of all those returning now are from our area. So that means that we have taken a bigger hit here than has British Columbia or Alaska, okay? And just to kind of emphasize, on the Columbia, artificially propagated salmon make up about 80% of the total number of salmon, and the total run has crashed to about 5% of historical abundance, okay? So some reasons, okay? We won't look at Lechitowicz in this particular rendition of this class, but this gives you a kind of general look at that, and this is posted again online, so I'm not going to go through these all here. But maybe the easiest way to kind of put a handle on this for you would be simply the H's of the salmon collapse, the wild salmon collapse. Hatcheries, harvest, okay, meaning fishing. So hatcheries have been a big part of the problem, and a lot of it's just the genetic degradation that happens. Harvest is another one. Habitat, and then hydropower. Those are the ones. Habitat is the stream area.